European colonizers employed several tactics to appropriate and misrepresent the Kemetic or ancient Egyptian legacy, which have had lasting impacts on how this civilization is perceived and studied. Here are some of the key tactics. This information has been researched, compiled, and brought to you by research analyst Sharri Plaza. Looting and artifact acquisition, direct looting. Colonizers, particularly during the 19th century, engaged in the systematic looting of Egyptian tombs and monuments. This was often done under the guise of archaeological exploration, but served to enrich European collections. Artifacts were taken from sites like the Valley of the Kings, often with minimal regard for their cultural significance. Purchases and auctions. Many artifacts entered European collections through auctions or direct purchases from local dealers who themselves might have acquired items through less ethical means. This included the acquisition of mummies and other human remains, which were sometimes seen as mere curiosities. Cultural appropriation and misrepresentation, racial and cultural misinterpretation. European scholars and artists often depicted ancient Egyptians with European features, leading to a misrepresentation of the civilization's racial and cultural identity. This has contributed to a narrative that aligns ancient Egypt more closely with European history rather than its African context. Suppression of indigenous narratives. European imperialism often overshadowed or entirely replaced indigenous historical narratives with their own interpretations, which were sometimes biased by colonial and racist ideologies. This included the portrayal of Egyptians in art and literature in ways that did not reflect their true heritage. Control over historical narrative. Academic and institutional control. The establishment of Egyptology as a field was largely dominated by Western scholars, many of whom brought colonial biases into their work. The control over how Egyptology was taught and researched meant that the narrative of ancient Egypt could be shaped to fit colonial frameworks, often ignoring or downplaying the African roots of Kemet. Publication of findings. The description de l'Egypte, resulting from Napoleon's expedition, was one of the first comprehensive surveys of Egypt, but was done under the shadow of imperialism, setting a precedent for how Egypt's history would be documented and understood. Economic exploitation. The rise of tourism in Egypt during colonial times led to an increase in the demand for artifacts, which were often sold off to tourists or collectors, further depleting Egypt's cultural heritage. This trade was not only a physical theft, but also represented an economic drain on Egypt's resources. Legal and diplomatic maneuvering. Many artifacts were taken during times when there were no laws or international agreements in place to protect cultural heritage, allowing for the free export of antiquities to Europe. Even when such laws began to emerge, the legacy of these actions meant many artifacts remained abroad. These tactics not only led to the physical theft of Egypt's cultural treasures, but also to a cultural and scholarly theft where the narrative of ancient Egyptian history was often dictated by colonial powers, influencing how generations have understood and misinterpreted the Kemetic legacy. Theft of intellectual property. European scholars often credited themselves with rediscovering or interpreting ancient Egyptian knowledge, particularly in fields like mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. For instance, the so-called Pythagorean theorem was known to the Egyptians well before Pythagoras, but it was named after him in the European tradition. Inventions or concepts like the calendar or hydraulic engineering were sometimes attributed to Greek or Roman influences, ignoring or downplaying the original Kemetic innovations. Cultural and religious appropriation, mythological and religious syncretism. European scholars sometimes merge or confused Egyptian deities with Greek or Roman gods, leading to a hybrid understanding of Egyptian religion that was more palatable or familiar to Western audiences. This included attributing Greek names to Egyptian gods, like calling Amun Zeus Ammon. Christianization of symbols. Early Christian missionaries and later European scholars reinterpreted Egyptian symbols, like the Ain, into Christian context, thereby diminishing the original cultural significance and attributing Christian origins to these symbols. Museum practices and display, selective display. European museums often displayed Egyptian artifacts in contexts that highlighted their mysterious or exotic nature rather than their cultural or historical significance. This often involved showcasing items out of cultural context, focusing on their aesthetic appeal or rarity rather than their role in Egyptian society. Ownership and retention. Even after the end of formal colonialism, many artifacts have not been repatriated, with European museums asserting rights of ownership based on historical acquisition, legal loopholes, or claims of better preservation capabilities. Education and academic influence, curriculum control. The way ancient Egypt was taught in European and later Western education systems often emphasized the impact on Greek and Roman civilizations while marginalizing the independent achievements of Kemet. This educational bias perpetuated a Eurocentric view of history. Academic gatekeeping. For many years, access to study materials, artifacts, and primary sources was controlled by Western institutions, limiting the ability of scholars from Egypt or Africa to reinterpret or reclaim their own historical narratives. Economic disenfranchisement through tourism. The monetization of heritage, the tourism industry, heavily promoted by colonial powers, turned Egyptian heritage into a commodity where the profits largely benefited foreign companies and governments rather than the local Egyptian economy or cultural preservation efforts. Physical alteration of sites, architectural changes. In some cases, colonial powers literally built upon ancient sites, altering or damaging them to suit modern needs or to create a legacy of their own presence. This could involve constructing buildings over ancient ruins or modifying sites for use in colonial administration. These tactics collectively contributed to a significant reappropriation of the Kemetic legacy, influencing how this ancient civilization is perceived, studied, and valued in the modern world. Creation of myth and legend, the mystification of Egypt, the portrayal of ancient Egypt in literature, art, and later media often leaned into occultism or mysticism, creating a narrative that Egypt was a land of magic and secrets, which both exoticized the culture and obscured its scientific and cultural achievements. Legends of curses, the notion of the curse of the pharaohs, was popularized by sensationalist journalism during the early 20th century, like after the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb. This narrative served to make Egypt seem mysterious and dangerous, further distancing it from its historical reality. Control over legal and diplomatic channels. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, treaties often favored European powers in terms of artifact removal. For example, the firman given to the British by the Ottoman authorities in the early 19th century allowed for the export of antiquities from Egypt, which led to the removal of the Rosetta Stone and other significant artifacts. Until relatively modern times, there were few international laws protecting cultural heritage, allowing for the legal or semi-legal exportation of artifacts. Even when such laws began to exist, enforcement was often weak or ignored. Manipulation of historical records. European historians sometimes wrote histories of Egypt that emphasized connections with classical Greece and Rome, often marginalizing the indigenous development of science, art, and governance in Egypt. The work of Egyptian or African scholars on their own history was often overlooked or discredited, ensuring that the narrative remained under European control. Architectural and site manipulation. In some cases, reconstructions or restorations of ancient sites were done in a way that reflected European architectural styles or interpretations rather than authentic Egyptian methods, altering the original character of the monuments. Colonial powers sometimes destroyed or altered ancient sites to make way for infrastructure projects like canals or railways, prioritizing modern utility over historical preservation. Media and cultural representation. Hollywood and popular culture. Movies, books, and other forms of media have often depicted ancient Egypt through a lens of fantasy or horror, further distancing the public from the real historical and cultural significance of Kemet. This has included casting non-Egyptian actors in roles of pharaohs or other historical figures, thus distorting cultural representation. Educational misrepresentation, textbooks, and educational tools. Even in educational materials, ancient Egypt was sometimes taught as an extension or precursor to Western civilization, rather than as a unique African civilization with its own contributions to humanity. Intellectual property theft in modern times. Branding and commercialization. Modern companies have often used Egyptian symbols, hieroglyphics, or themes in branding without acknowledging or compensating for the cultural heritage they are drawing from, essentially profiting off the imagery and mystique of ancient Egypt. These practices have not only led to the physical loss of artifacts, but have also shaped a narrative around ancient Egypt that often does not reflect the true depth, diversity, and originality of Kemetic civilization. This has implications for cultural identity, heritage, and the global understanding of history. This has been a Sharri Plaza presentation.